Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the next leg of the podcast relay. Give you a couple of minutes for those of you who are signing in, just to get yourself settled and get yourself tuned in to the latest leg of the podcast relay, following on from Casper Berry last week. Great conversation that Casper and I had, and he has very generously handed over the baton to Dan Stembridge, who joins us from Falmouth this afternoon. Afternoon, Dan. How are you?
Afternoon. Good to be here.
Yeah, great to see you. And, as everyone who's tuning in knows, we are each week exploring the theme of If I Knew Then, What I Know Now, and seeing what conversation that takes us on each week. And just, really enjoying stories that people are sharing, perspectives that they have gained over time, being really generous with their self-reflection and openness as well. And it's been really great for us from Planet K2 to sort of see a lot of the connection with performance and confidence, and also I think the deep self-reflection that people have gone through, which has ended up in them being in a position with some great stories to tell and reflect on, and having achieved some great things. So we're very much looking forward to, Dan, hearing your reflections on that as well. But I guess a couple of things to give context for everyone who's tuning in. So Casper made the handover last week. We know that you've got a background sort of, in flying, RAF, Navy, but can you give us, your version of your history and a little bit of your story that brings you here today? And it'd be great to get, that fit through your words.
Right. Well, yeah, indeed. I spent 30 years in the Royal Navy.
Okay.
Pretty much split in two ways. The first sort of 15 to 20 years was primarily in the cockpit of aircraft. I flew helicopters for a few years in the early 90s, and then from the mid 90s for the next sort of 10 to 12 years, I flew fighter planes, either the Sea Harrier fighter plane with the Royal Navy, or the F-18 with the United States Navy from their carriers, and the AV-8B Harrier with the United States Marine Corps. So a lot of flying in those types of jobs, and then take the sort of second half of the career, although I did a little bit of flying in there, mostly that was into more sort of senior management roles,
right. Okay.
Culminating in a job as the commanding officer of an air station of sort of 3,000 people, and the CAG, the air boss for the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers. So for the air group that was embarked in that carrier strike group. Okay. So that's pretty much what's taken me to here. And I left the Navy earlier this year and started up my own business.
Excellent timing to go out on a new business as we enter.
Perfect, as ever. Yeah.
How's lockdown been for you? What's the experience been like?
It's been pretty good, actually. Yeah, we've nobody's throttled anyone in the house. As me, my wife Helen, and two teenage daughters. So we've just about survived so far. Got one daughter who's about to go back to university for her second year.
Right.
Fingers crossed she goes, well, for her sake, she goes back to university. And the youngest daughter, she's got GCSEs next year. So yeah, it's been not too bad. And the weather down here, apart from this last couple of weeks, has been amazing. So apart from lockdown, there's definitely worse places to be.
Yeah, I can imagine. As a regular visitor down to Cornwall, I said there's a few places down there that it would be good to be sort of locked down and enjoying the countryside and the surrounds. So, yeah, great to get that sort of intro and then a little bit of current context. So, and just listening to that story of 30 years worth of service in different forms, that feels like there's a really interesting sort of foundation for you. I guess you could pick on any number of key moments or key situations, but let's see where we go. So when we pose the thought, if I knew then what I know now, is there anything that comes to mind for you, particular points in time or certain context? Where does your head go instantly when you start that reflective process?
Well, clearly, as a fighter pilot, I would, the older I get, the better I was. So actually, I look back and go, well, there's nothing, clearly. But actually, the more I thought about it, the sort of bucket of stories and of thoughts about what I would perhaps do differently in looking back in time grew and grew and grew. So actually it became more of a problem of triaging what
Right.
those.
Okay. Yeah.
I think primarily it's around something that we do very well in aviation, and particularly in fighter aviation, that we don't necessarily bring into every other aspect of our working lives or our personal lives.
Right.
And so where we're very, very good, and I guess if you look back historically, it's because we've killed a lot of people both in training and in combat, is that we train really hard to learn from our mistakes. Okay. And so we spend an inordinate amount of time planning, briefing, then we execute the mission, but then debriefing and learning from that, so that we don't make the same mistakes, and that we understand where we've been good and make sure that we spread that wider. And it's a really, the more I've stepped back from it, the more impressed I've been in the way that we do that, because you kind of take it for granted when you're sat within it. But what we don't tend to do is to take that sort of methodology, if you like, and that thought process and apply it to everything else. And so whether we're, in more management roles, we don't necessarily, make sure that our plan is aligned to our strategic aim. We don't necessarily spend more time briefing and formally bringing everybody into the brief so that everybody truly understands. And then again, debriefing. We don't sit down and formally debrief in a way that we do from a fighter mission. And so I guess if I were to look back on it, it would be bring some of that culture, because it is, it's ingrained in us. Yeah. You get back from a mission and, go away, jump in your car and don't debrief it. You feel like you've driven away without your underpants on. Right. It feels so odd to not do it. And yet we do that in our everyday life. So I think it would be bring that more into other aspects of work.
And when in the process the process of developing into that world, when do you get introduced to that briefing rhythm and ritual, and sort of when do you start to appreciate the real power of it? Because for me, it's a skill that people learn. I'm just wondering for you, when did you first start to realize the power of it, the value of it, and become skillful at it? What was the process of developing that briefing mindset, I guess?
It's really, it's very much from the start of flying. The first aeroplane I ever flew was a Chipmunk, right. Which was, and I'm now definitely showing my age, a Chipmunk that was originally designed actually in the 30s and 40s. And some of my instructors flew combat missions in Korea in 1950. In fact, there was one instructor who flew, who was an ex-Air Force guy who flew in World War II, flew Sunderlands and Spitfires, bizarrely, a bizarre mix of aeroplanes. But anyway, yeah. And these were all old retired guys who used to do our initial sort of grading in flying. And, they obviously from a very dangerous age of flying in the 40s, 50s and 60s in particular, it was ingrained in them and they ingrained that in us. And so it was right from the start, right from, and I joined pretty much straight out of school. So it became normalized really quickly. And so it was very difficult to see, in some respects, the benefit. You're doing it because the culture is teaching you to do it. And I guess that's the other aspect, is the power of culture. And it makes you do, in this sense, extraordinarily brilliant things, but it also can make people do extraordinarily bad things.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned with the briefing and the mission and then the debriefing, are there different methods depending upon what's happened in the mission? So if things have all gone swimmingly, does the debriefing go in a certain way compared to if things haven't quite gone to plan? Is there a different mindset, or is it the same method independent of the mission?
It's the same. It's the same method, actually, because you even if it's gone well, there will always be things that you could have done better.
Okay.
I think it's having that mindset that which can be very irritating. Ask my wife, can be very irritating for people. Even when things have gone well, you're still trying to find some things that didn't go quite as well.
Yeah.
But actually, the length of the debrief is normally down to the complexity of the task. And so I wouldn't say that everyone's exactly the same, but the fundamental aspect of why you need to treat them the same, regardless of how you think it went, is that the more complex the task, the more people that are involved.
Right. Okay.
And your perspective of what happened prior to going into that debrief might be very different to mine, which would be very different to somebody else. So actually part of it is coming to a common understanding of what happened, because only when you've understood that can you really get to whether things were done well, bad, indifferently, and therefore you can learn.
Did you therefore get better as you did that more in terms of bringing in your independent view to the process, because that's the responsibility, rather than to begin with? Is there more reticence to share because you kind of want to know what other people, it's almost trying to get a group think, are we all on the same page, rather than actually we've got to start from our independent views to follow the conversation to get to a shared picture?
Yeah, you've got and actually the biggest no-no in debriefing is to cover something up, and it's very much looked upon negatively. We understand, because we look around the crew room in a fighter squadron. You look around and go, well, he's an idiot, I'm an idiot, we're all idiots, we all make mistakes, and therefore we're happy to put our hand up and admit when we've done something wrong.
Yeah.
And the way that you keep developing that culture is actually, you don't applaud people being bad, clearly, but you applaud people for being honest about something and making a mistake. And the exact opposite is the case if you find out that somebody has done something and covered it up. Because if you cover it up, it starts with a little thing, then it can get to something big, and eventually you'll kill somebody, because you'll be covering up mistakes that may not have tripped you up or your colleagues up in the past, but ultimately may do in the future.
Yeah.
And I think it's because those stakes are very different. They're about people's lives. It forces you to be that way. The sad thing is that we don't apply that even when it doesn't matter in other aspects of business, perhaps.
Yeah. And I think I've seen clinical debrief process with a room full of, it must have been nearly 60 people, a helicopter emergency medical service, everyone kind of involved, but doing case reviews. There's 3 or 4 people talking about the actual sort of job that was done, and then you've got the medics talking about it, but then there's loads of other people involved as well to kind of be in that process. And you definitely see the due diligence taking place when there are life and death lessons to be learned, and it's a really precious form of sharing, and also the culture bit you mentioned. I think there's safety in that sometimes as well. I don't know if that's part of the process, going into high risk situations together as well, but knowing there's that safety around learning together and moving on together and responding together.
Yeah, and there's a safety in the sort of physical sense of safety, but there's as I think you're alluding to, is there's the sort of there's an emotional safety in being able to make mistakes. There's you're able to get over the fact that people are going to make mistakes. We all do, and I think it would be foolish to think otherwise. And so we try and stamp out any a blame culture, and it's not a no blame culture, it's a just culture. And so there's a difference between consciously going against rules or a brief or or an agreement in whatever sense it may be. There's a difference between formally making a mental decision to disregard it and just failing to implement it very well.
Yeah
That's a mistake.
Yeah. You just reminded me of my favourite joke, which is, whenever you've got a blame culture, just go around asking everyone whose fault it is there's a blame culture, and no one ever owns up. It's just like, it's not me.
Yeah, yeah,
It's must be someone's fault.
yeah,
We need to really find out whose issue it is. But I think that differentiation between the absence of a blame culture isn't what you're after. It's the presence of a just culture, which allows that kind of assumption of positive intent, knowing that people are qualified to be there, that everyone is always seeking to bring the best of their ability to situations. And it, as you were talking about, it was making me wonder about, how do you reflect on that process of being in an environment where the margins for error are tiny, so you're trying not to make errors, and so there's and you're reducing errors and kind of by increasing accuracy and all of the stuff that you do from a training point of view, but actually then being able to talk openly if something wasn't as close to the standard as it should be. That feels like there's some challenging sort of forces at play there against each other.
Yeah, and of course it's a bit like going out, so there's what you can't do is go out there to not make mistakes.
Yeah.
So, because otherwise it's a bit like going out to not lose a game.
Mm-hmm.
Which, it drives a behavior in you where you're more likely to lose the game.
Yeah.
You have to go out there and, because and it can, particularly if you're talking about, it's rarely like this, by the way, but if you're talking about, 1v1 fighting,
mm-hmm.
It's you against somebody else, and therefore it's about ultimately winning that joust, that engagement. But driving yourself to a position where all you're trying to do is be as safe as you can, you won't be very effective. So you have to have a balance in there as well of what is it you're trying to achieve, and then achieve that as safely as possible. Not how can I be as safe as possible, and then what does that allow me to achieve?
Yeah.
So, and that's where Casper and I have an interesting sort of conversation, because actually what he generally talks about, as you know, is about allowing organizations the freedom to
mm-hmm.
take risks, and to they should free themselves up to taking those risks. Whereas a lot of aviation, particularly if you talk about naval aviation, landing on an aircraft carrier at night is a inherently dangerous activity, not just for the pilot, but actually for everybody on the ship. You're flying a 30-ton missile at an aircraft, at a ship, with a lot of people in very close proximity. So, there's definitely, in that aspect, there's a job to do. So you have to land on the ship.
Yeah.
And then you look at, how do I make that as safe as possible? And therefore you have to try and do everything to minimize those risks to life. Yeah. And so there is definitely a tension in there and a balance.
Yeah, and that's always what I see in terms of recommendations for how to do stuff. Context is everything. And where we've got an organisation that is looking to kind of innovate and disrupt and do new things, it's got freedom. There isn't constraint that it's worried about. But then you go into a financial services arena, which is highly regulated, and you can't just make up your own rules and do it the way, you've kind of got, there's all these constraints around different contexts, which I think are so important for people to factor into the debriefing performance process. As you were talking, I was wondering around that kind of the ability for you to go out and sort of seek to fly with the kind of freedom that you talk about and execute what needs to be effective, and the culture point you made, and that safety physically. What difference has it made for you, depending upon the nature of the other people around you and that culture, in terms of your ability to go and fly the way that you need to? Is there a relationship between surrounding culture and your flying confidence, skill, etc.?
Yeah, well, I think any culture will affect how you behave in it. And actually, the one thing that is for sure is, when you're in it, you're probably the worst person in the world to understand it.
Right. Okay.
And actually, that's why what you need is some ability, and therefore some external ability, to be able to look at something. So, if I look back now, so you can do that by looking back in time at something, but at the moment that you're in it, you need somebody physically to not be a part of that culture, to be able to provide you with some objective assessment of what that culture is like. Is it, where is it influencing your activity in a positive sense, and where is it actually erring towards something which is perhaps either negative, or in this case of safety critical, or business performance perhaps, where it's safety critical, it may be actually driving you to a strategic failure in your business, or a strategic failure in terms of an accident. And so it does affect your behavior, most definitely, but confidence is part of it, and part of that is that all being in it together and feeling that you're all part of something that is bigger than you. And I'm sure you must have seen that in sport. It's definitely the case within squadrons and units, even to the point of nonsense, where you're in such competition with your sister squadron, you'll make really poor decisions just to be slightly better than them. And actually that's where you need somebody to go, okay, we get the competition, but just calm yourselves down.
Again, the sport reference just makes me wonder, in that environment, because it takes a pretty confident, strong ego to want to be, in control of an aircraft that's, the price that it is capable of doing and what it is. What did you notice about that development process of some strong individuals with high ego, but then their ability to kind of, the culture is more important than me? What did you notice there, or did you have any learnings there as well that were useful for you when you went into the command position?
Yeah, well, you definitely there's a strength and a weakness in having a hierarchical organization,
right?
And so there are you start off lower down in an organization, and therefore those in a more senior and experienced position, both in terms of their age, management, leadership, but also in terms of their skills, handling skills in an airplane. And they're very different. Some of the best, some of the best leaders are not necessarily the best fighter pilots, right. And vice versa. And so, you do need to separate those, but there's certainly, a structure and a history and a hierarchy that helps you in keeping in check within that structure. But as you move on to more senior roles, you reach back to your own personal experiences, and actually in line with what we're talking about here, if I knew then what I know now, it does teach you to self-reflect. I look back at some of the things that we did, in our squadron, and we were we were exceptionally good at what we did. We did some things that I am definitely, wouldn't be proud of, and I definitely would have come down very hard on as the CEO of an air station with 9 squadrons. If one of my squadrons, had an attitude, which a lot was around about time, but an attitude to, aviation, alcohol, and basically lack of sleep, and getting up and going flying the next morning, I'd be really disappointed. But actually, a lot of that is, looking back over 20, 25 years, where attitudes to it were very different to how they are now. So you have to evolve with the time, and actually it's I guess somewhat timely in what we're looking at nationally at the moment in terms of our history. You have to put context to everything that you look at, and make sure that you move forward and learn from it.
Yeah, and that's certainly what I'm getting as well from the overall sense of the brief, mission, debriefing. It's that constant evolution. However delighted or devastated you are, or anywhere in between, all of this process is done to advance future confidence, as well as better collaboration, better collegiality, all of those kind of things as well. So I think it's it does feel particularly relevant to demonstrate the forward looking, are we going to see a change? So I always use the concept that learning's only said to have taken place when you can observe a relatively permanent change in behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one thing acquiring loads of knowledge, but it's another thing actually that knowledge leading to, you know, some obvious, you know, subtle or obvious changes. And it's the feed forward process, I guess, which the you know, debriefing is really about the future rather than the past.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting for people.
Yeah, it is. And I think the other aspect is that, you know, when people ask me about, you know, people particularly who are interested in aviation,
yeah,
from the outside, you know, from the outside looking in, you know, they watch Top Gun and they want to talk to you about fighter planes.
Yeah,
they generally,
how many dog fights have you won?
Exactly. How fast does it go, mister? How high does it go? But they generally want to ask you about the equipment, about the technology. And actually, the interesting thing is, and the same is the case with the debrief, we have a lot of technology, we have a lot of equipment, we use a lot of analysis and data science to help us understand and feed that in. But actually, fundamentally, the brief, it's a human endeavor. So what you're trying to do is, whatever the technology is that sits around it, it's about understanding how humans are interacting and how that's affecting human behaviors, how that's affecting human outcomes. And if I think back to all of the stories that I have swirling around in my head from 30 years in the Navy, it's always about the people. I miss flying then with those people, doing what I was doing then. I don't wish I was doing it now. And so it's always about the human being. And it's the same with the debrief. Whatever technology you bring to it, it's about getting a common understanding of what's happened and then learning from it.
Yeah. I was doing something the other night and sort of, you know, reflecting on the fact that artificial intelligence is not really of any use unless you've got actual intelligence of people alongside it to kind of be, you know, the interface between, you know, what that is saying and what you want to be doing. And you know, and certainly elite sport is all around trying to create the data you want rather than just sort of wait to see if you've produced the data that you like the look of.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And making it fit the argument that you want. And, you know, it's, and I think the other thing is, just because you can measure something doesn't mean that you should. And just because you can't doesn't mean it's not important.
Yeah, okay.
And I think that sits in a lot of people's views over investing in data science as an answer to their problems. And it's only part of the answer, because you've got to know the right questions to ask, you've got to have the right expectations of what you're going to get back, and you've got to be able to work with it appropriately to get that benefit from it. And that's a human endeavor.
Yeah. Well, as a psychologist, having never really been able to measure anything through my career, then I'm you know, delighted. You know, I'm always jealous of the physiologists who can actually, you know, measure stuff. You know, they got machines that make noises and everything. It's really impressive. I think that's that subjective, objective, you know, relationship is really key. How did you manage that sort of, you know, I guess as the pilot who is that interface as well, and sort of your subjective feel for something versus the data or the, you know, the actual what the aircraft is saying? How did you develop the confidence to trust the subjective feel as much as what an instrument's telling you?
Experience.
Right. Okay.
So and pass down experience as well, and always be wary of that when someone says tried and tested. You know, we've always done it this way just because we have. But actually, there's a little bit of it's having confidence of not being an output based organization purely. Right. Now, obviously, output is important, but if you don't focus on the things that you can't measure, like, you know, the world that you live in, you've lived in elite sport, then if you're not confident enough to invest in that and invest in the people, then you're not going to reap the rewards. And experience will show you that, because you'll just be purely focused on an output, and then you'll forget about the people, and then they won't perform, and then your output will fail.
Yeah.
So it's having the confidence to focus on that, I would say. The other is to resist the temptation of always trying to quantify something. So, 8 out of 10 cats prefer whatever it may be.
Yeah.
It's purely based on a subjective assessment of somebody asking whether their cat liked it or not.
Yeah.
And we do that in aviation, certainly in operational test. We'll give, rather than measuring the parameters specifically, we'll give somebody a new software, a new weapon, a new something, get them to go and fly with it. And then we'll talk about it subjectively. How would you rate that in terms of this type of mission set?
Yeah.
And they'll give you a score, and then you'll add it up, and then you'll end up with a number or a percentage or a color or and people want to see that who are investing money in it. They want investment decisions, which these are billion-pound investment decisions, are often based on, subjective data that you've added up to make look as if it's something that is now quantifiable.
That's fine. You just do things like call it nominal group technique, and all of a sudden it takes on a power of its own. Or instead of a line that you sort of have that's a certain length and you draw, you call that a visual analog scale. That now instantly that we now have the power of something that's much more impressive than it is. But I think that for me is the interesting thing within the culture, where you have a culture of expertise, where the people who are producing those subjective measures have a shared mental model of what excellence looks like and are tuned into certain stuff. So if I participated in something, I wouldn't be my subjective data wouldn't be any use, because I don't have those reference points and some of that cultural reference that's so important in there as well. And I guess that's some of the stuff you're saying about reflecting on the power of culture, because there's the passed on wisdom, the individual read, and the desire to move things on. And you're getting that constant blend of experts driving things forward, rather than anyone who fancies throwing an opinion in having an influence.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say it's and of course it only goes part way towards those investment decisions. It's not as if they're making them. But actually, an interesting one that came to my mind when you were saying that was about diversity, because of course if you get a bunch of people who've all grown up the same, been through the same training, been into the same sorts of squadrons, same sorts of experiences, from very similar backgrounds, etc., you'll end up with an answer that is probably not very not very effective. And so things like exchanges. So my exchange tour with the US Navy was an interesting one, where you embed yourself into their organization. And actually I was in the operational test squadron, is where it's the final check before things go to the front line. So before they go on operations. So you have the very latest equipment. It's very expensive, and you're asking people to give to give their subjective and objective understanding of that equipment, to give it the thumbs up or the thumbs down in broad sense. And if you've got people involved in that program that have flown various different aircraft types, you'll get a better answer than if you've got people that have only flown that aircraft type. So actually what they tended to do was bring in lots of different aircraft types in the US Navy, and of course the token foreigner. And so I had a very different perspective on some of the equipment and software that was being introduced, and I could bring a different perspective that said, have you thought about this or this or this? And I can think of some really interesting, probably not that interesting to you, but some interesting examples of where they carried over from one mark of aircraft to another the same mistakes in 3 different ones. And it took the idiot to go, why don't you do it this way with radar symbology? And everyone went, well, we've always done it that way since 1960. This had been in this radar that had evolved over time to this most modern of radars, but they still did the same symbology. So my point is, it takes somebody from the outside, it takes a bit of diversity to be able to spot these things. And so you've got to make sure that you do that in every part of your business.
Yeah, yeah, and again, for me, that comes back to having the confidence to be that sort of outlier voice. And you know, again, back to culture. How do you create a culture which celebrates the outlier voice and gives it space to be heard, whilst also the culture remaining strong? And I think that's some of the stuff people worry about. Well, we can't have too many dissenting voices. Well, they're not dissenting, are they?
Yeah.
They're adding expert value, and yeah, I think that feels like that's quite a balance. Were you able to sort of use in your leadership positions? Was that something you were able to sort of balance? Were there any particular things that you found useful in sort of helping keep those voices sort of unity and sort of, you know, desire to see the wood for the trees?
Yeah, it depends on your organization. You know, anyone will tell you that you need to pick a diverse team around you, and different types, whether it be different types of personality or whether it be people from different backgrounds, ethnicities, whatever it may be. You know, you want to have, you know, something that is more widely representative.
Yeah.
The difficulty that you have in lots of large organizations, and the Navy's no different, is you don't always have choice. You arrive and you're part of a team that's, now there's benefit in that, because of course, if you start picking your team, there are those that would pick people that look exactly like them, behave exactly like them, and funny old thing, would sit like a mirror in front of them and say, what a brilliant idea that was, boss. Yeah. So, you know, you do need, you know, there needs to be a bit of balance in there, but sometimes you can't help the team that you have. But you can help how you behave in it. And so, you know, that might be, as the boss, is not speaking first, making sure that other people are given the opportunity to speak first, so that they don't have to disagree with you if they've got a different perspective, because they're going first. And it takes a bit of time to get people used to that, because they feel a little bit nervous. But it's also accepting that, as the boss, that even though you think you know the answer, I mean, there were often times where I thought, I know what the answer is here, can we just get there a bit quicker? And actually, you know, they'd come to the same answer of me, and so I'd walk home thinking to myself, you see, I'm just getting there quicker than these guys. But it's useful to let them do that, because it makes them feel more involved. And actually,
a proper leader.
Yeah, I'm doing the right thing. And then, you know, a few months later, they're coming up with an idea that's different to mine, and I'm thinking, well, I'll let them run with it. And eventually, I'm getting to the point of, that's a far better idea than mine ever was. And so you've got to allow those opportunities, and you can't just do it once and expect it to work. You've got to keep doing it, and you'll surprise yourself. And actually, you'll look back and go, I should have done that more and more and more and more. And I wish I had. I did. I really do.
Yeah, and that mirrors a lot of the work we do with teams around, you know, building team effectiveness habits, rather than having a 2-day offsite once a year and kind of go, it's all right, we've done our teamwork. You kind of haven't really, have you? It's what's the daily habits and the weekly habits that demonstrate the commitment to the kind of team that you want to be, and the kind of output that you want and reputation you want to have with yourselves and with other people. And I think that's the discipline of it that's critical, keeping going with the stuff that works.
Yeah, and it's interesting, actually. I would imagine, and it's the same parallel. I know you're asking me the questions, but I've got a question for you, and that's about, you know, if you think about elite sport, and you know, I love my rugby, and I look back to, you know, Lions tours in the 70s. You know, where you definitely look at that and say, you know, what a, you know, how amazing to bring together all those people from different nations, you know, who were battering each other in the Six Nations to come and work together, and that sort of that team ethos. Well, a lot of that was built around the fact that it wasn't necessary. You could argue that some of that was built around the fact that it wasn't professional, that they were out down the pub every night and they bonded with each other in areas that were outside of elite sport. How do you find it now now that much like in aviation, we can't be out, you know, down the pub with our mates and then up flying the next morning? The same is the case with elite sport. How do they find those, you know, those opportunities to truly bond and let their guard down, so that they understand each other as human beings?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of that, certainly from my experience with the rowing setup, a lot of that just came from the amount of time they were spending together in training camps, and, you know, beyond the training, there has to be certain things to do to entertain yourself and actually, keep things going. And very creative in terms of, some of the things that were shared, some of the things that they were doing, which allowed the people to be the people.
Yeah.
And to get to know each other a little bit more. So you would definitely see, some. If I think of some of the things that the men's team have done in the past when they go up to a high altitude camp, and there's always something that they'll do up there to keep themselves entertained. And there's someone who will be taking on, kind of social itinerary stuff or deciding what the thing is that they're going to try and do. So space and proximity, and actually needing to do some stuff that is a contrast, and very quickly it gets to the point of understanding the people a bit more behind there as well. But that's again the experience and the shared experience of going through the whole thing, rather than just turning up and doing the training every day and going off home. So there's a lot of that they do kind of get to see the investment of each other and the importance of the whole thing to each other as well. So I think there are obviously within that the friendships grow as well, and so there are pockets of the social stuff outside of it as well. From the sport perspective, it's always really interesting because you kind of go, right, get the task cohesion absolutely spot on, and any benefit you can get from the social cohesion adds value. But there's lots of teams in the past have kind of gone social first. We'll have a bit of a laugh, and we'll hope that somewhere we find a team in this.
It's shared experiences ultimately, isn't it? I mean, you spend, we do deployments for 6 months locked up in a tin box, 24 hours a day. You're not getting more than a few hundred yards from anybody. It's just not that big. So it's sort of, you have those times, and often just times of utter boredom, where you're playing a game of uckers, which to the uninitiated is not Ludo, but it's a game that's very similar. Playing these sorts of games, sharing those experiences, the highs and lows of everything, builds that bond in people that allows them to go that extra mile for them. And again, it's not quantifiable, but I do think it's really important.
And certainly the culture bit that you talk about, and thinking about the culture of pride around the performance, but also pride around that the people who we know and who we're part of in terms of building that performance. It's more than output stuff by such a long way.
And I bet most of the stories that some of the great rowers that you've worked with, I bet most of the stories when they get together, over a dinner or whatever it may be, will not be about when they won an Olympic gold. It will be about, something that nobody else knows about. It's just a story that's funny to them, or an experience when something happened. It won't be about that, this amazing event that everybody's got a part of. So actually, it doesn't, in some ways, isn't necessarily quite as special.
And absolutely, there's the public have the insight into that as well. Going back to the Lions, I remember one of the videos, the first Lions tours, when actually a friend of mine working for Impact was involved in some of the team building stuff that was going on. But I remember one of the speeches, it wasn't Ian McGeechan, it was someone else, but saying, in years to come, we're going to look back at this, and it will just take a look. That's all it's going to take. And there's all of that stuff around, the meaning of it and what we've created together, and that's the stuff that will come back to life.
Yes.
The relationships and the kind of the personal experiences that were part of that as well. Is there for you, reflecting back on the early bits of commanding and sort of being the person at the top in that position to make those kind of speeches, is there stuff that you learned early that helped you, shape a culture with the people who were going to be part of the culture? So you've talked about kind of leaders talking last and that kind of stuff. Was there any bigger picture stuff that you did to kind of set the parameters of, this is what it is that we're going to be part of, or how did you sort of do bigger picture stuff?
The first day at the one of the first days I arrived at the base, I went into a hangar, guys working on an aircraft, and I asked him what he was doing. He said, well, I'm fixing the rotorhead, sir. And I said, right, but why are you doing it? And he said, well, it's broken. So I said, no, but why? And he's obviously not quite getting the thread. He said, well, the chief's told me to fix it. And I said, no, you're doing it because you're providing aircraft to protect the nuclear deterrent, to support counter-terrorism, and to defend the nation's aircraft carriers.
Yeah.
And, you know, a bit of a blank look. But actually, what I did there was build a clear understanding of why people were doing it, and then found ways to not only get that message to the people who work there, whether they were military or civilian, but also to their families. Because if you're going to send people away for months on end, you know, and their families are going to be left behind, you know, you have to at least feel that what you're doing has got some value, rather than I'm fixing the helicopter or the aircraft because it's broken and it needs to be fixed. Yeah. You know, it needs to be something a bit more strategic than that. And therefore it's about what you're doing to the national effort, that you feel as if you're doing something that's important. And so I think there's that. And then at the really tactical level, it's just about spending time and being human and just talking to people. And so it was always, I had a brilliant base warrant officer, the sort of senior non-commissioned officer on the base, Bridget Turner, and she would come into the office every day and get me out of my office and take me somewhere on the base. Yeah, and it's 3,000 people, you know, so it's not as if you go in, you know, you could visit every place on the base and not see everyone in a year, but she made sure I got out and just spent time having a cup of coffee, having a discussion with people, and message gets out that you're approachable, that you're a human being, that you're not this person that sits here and doesn't understand them.
Yeah, that classic stuff, you know, managing by walking about, and a lot of the stuff that's been talked about and that, you know, people, I think as soon as something becomes, you know, an acronym of MBWA, you know, kind of, well, you know, but actually forgetting the fact that, no, look, this thing is there because it makes a difference to how people feel about what they're part of. And I think that's so important, particularly now as well, where we can't kind of manage by walking about and kind of, you know, everyone's kind of working virtually. It's what's the equivalent of that, and how important is that stuff going to be when things, you know, return to a situation where there is going to be more interaction face to face. And that, you know, I think that's so important to look at the, you know, it's not the single act of managing by walking about because I've been told that's a good thing to do. It's the realization of, you know, that what that means and the opportunities that creates to reinforce how you're working together.
Yeah, and it's creating those non-transactional relationships, and that's the problem with virtual working. Things become very, very transactional in the way that you deal with things. And so if you took one of those walkabouts, if I hadn't done it, it would matter not a jot. And that's the mindset that you have when you sat in your office and you're a bit busy and it's a bit of an embarrassment to go and go and do it. But if you add that up over 2 or 3 years, and hundreds of those walkabouts, those are really important.
Yeah. Well, you hope you get to the point where if you didn't walk around for a couple of days, people are kind of going,
"Where is he?
Where is he?
You're right."
Yeah. But also, you know, that I think that's the part of it where you start to build a culture that people recognise they're part of and that they contribute to in a certain way. And there's an expected rhythm of things, but also a personal responsibility to play a part in it as well. And that, you know, that's, you and I, when we were speaking the other day, I said, you know, I keep asking people at the moment about, you know, if what was going on in your head and your chosen behaviors, if those were instantly mirrored by everyone else in your organization, how worried would you be about the culture that you're creating? You know, so my attitude and my behaviors, everyone else is mirroring them, but, you know, is this somewhere I want to be, or is this, am I starting to think, well, I'm a little, I need to have a word with myself, you know, and it's that balance between where you've got the influence, absolutely use it, but everyone has the responsibility to lead the culture from their place. I guess that's a lot of what you're alluding to.
Yes, yeah, and and you can set that example that it's okay to take that time to go and do it. And not only that, but it's important that you do it. And I remember bosses of mine telling me this when I was a young lieutenant.
Right.
Going, yeah, whatever. You know, right, okay, I'll go down in the hangar and I'll go and have a chat with the lads, you know, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But I didn't see, every time I did it, I enjoyed it, but I still needed to be nudged to do it.
Yeah.
And actually, again, you know, the older you get, the more you realize actually that really was important.
Yeah.
And is important. And the things that you find out things that you were never intending to find out. That's the beauty of those sorts of interactions, is if you only find out things when, you know, I want to find this out, I'm going to go and ask a question, I'll get an answer, that's what it is. That's what email does to people.
Yeah.
It becomes transactional because there's nothing else around it. You bound it in how it is. A conversation, as we've just attested to, you know, can go anywhere. You never know where it's going to go, and actually might take you to a place where you go, oh God, yeah, I remember something, and you tell a story, and that sticks with people, or, you know, and allows them to then share a story of theirs that makes them think differently, and you share those things, and every now and again, in fact, more than every now and again, you get a nugget of something that you were never expecting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, at the moment, and the theme coming out here around, you know, the importance of the human side of it, and the people behind the performance, and never losing sight of that, feels like, you know, just such a really good place to reflect upon, you know, and sort of, you know, finish on your boss is telling you this thing, but the realization of the importance of it, and that being a critical success factor along the way, is so key. And you mentioned a little while ago around just culture, and if anyone's listening who sort of wants to pick up on just culture as a topic, Sidney Dekker is probably the main author who has written a lot on that area as well. Fascinating area, particularly coming out of aviation, but also healthcare, and the importance of creating a just culture. But I think all of us in the environments that we're part of, the aspiration to sort of deliver a just culture and be part of it, and, you know, is really, really valuable, and definitely the opposite of a blame culture. So any last thoughts, just to finish up on around if I knew then what I know now, any final nuggets or conclusions for you?
God, I wish I'd thought about that before, and I could have come up with something snappy, couldn't I? I think it's, you know, always question, whether that's yourself or others. That doesn't mean that you don't trust people. It just means that you're just seeking to understand. Because if you don't understand it, you can't either reap the rewards of how good it is, or fix it if it's not right. So question.
Yeah, so question. They're brilliant. They're really, really, really useful. And yeah, we've managed to get through that entire conversation without getting too geeky about aircraft and getting excited about some of the amazing things you must have done at the sort, you know, at the controls of some remarkable bits of machinery. But maybe that's for another occasion. Dan, it's been fascinating listening to your reflections, and I'm keen to know where the baton goes next for us. So from your world of sort of aviation and culture, what's the handover for next week?
Well, it's a handover to the police. So
okay.
I'm going to hand over to a chap called Sean West.
Oh, not Sting. So I was getting excited there. I'll go back to the 1980s. Never mind.
Oh dear. See, look, you've deflated him now. He'll be very disappointed. You're going to be very disappointed that he's not going to sing. Well, perhaps he will sing.
Perhaps he will. Who knows? So you were going to say, sorry.
Yeah, Sean West, who's a senior, very senior police officer, very experienced, got a lot of great stories, been all around the world in the course of his work, and currently is chairing a COVID-19 group that's looking across all government departments and about how we sort of react and deal with this emergency. So he'll have, I'm sure, some great stories to tell and great reflections of his time in the police.
Yeah, fantastic. You know, so I instantly think there that you know, if I knew then what I know now, sometimes it might be a week ago that you're reflecting on rather than sort of several years. So it could be quite interesting in that context, just to have a look at that. No, fantastic handover. That's superb. So I'll certainly look forward to that, and I'll pick up with Sean and get everything ready for next Friday, which is also my youngest 7th birthday. So I'll be breaking away from birthday parties to do this bit in the middle of the day, and then get onto that as well. So it's going to be a nice contrast of a day, sort of, you know.
Indeed, yeah.
So looking forward to that. But look, really appreciate the generosity of your time and your openness today, Dan. So thank you very much. As ever, folks, this will be available on the Performance Room. So keep looking into that. And if you're interested in any of the stuff we're doing, get on the Planet K2 website, have a look at that stuff as well. Dan's company, Whole Ship, as well, loads of great stuff that he's doing with a kind of that data area and also culture within businesses. So do look at that as well. But I'll leave you to your afternoon, sir. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much, and take care, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks very much.
Cheers. Thank you.